Greetings. Let me give you some comments about those Confederate Civil War generals. General Winfield Scott knew that Robert E. Lee was the best soldier in the American Army, so he offered to give him command of the entire Union Army. Lee turned us down. He sided with Virginia and states' rights. If Lee had taken command, I think the rebellion would have been put down in short order. The shots at Fort Sumter and the First Battle of Manassas were all victories for the South and credited to Beauregard. The services of the hero of Fort Sumter, Pierre G.T. Beauregard, were not utilized to their fullest due to bad blood between the Confederate general and the President of the Confederacy, Jeff Davis. Lee went off to the South and became Jeff Davis's military advisor. He did not become a real factor until Joe Johnston got shot at the Battle of Seven Pines. Turned out that the shot that wounded Joe was one of the luckiest rounds ever fired in favor of the rebels. At the time General Johnston was wounded, the Union Army was within 7 miles of Richmond. Lee replaced Johnston and gave McClellan a solid thrashing. We lost the Peninsula Campaign. Lee went on then to conduct a string of tremendous victories. Battles like the Second Manassas, Chancellorsville, and Fredericksburg come to mind. He survived Sharpsburg or Antietam and did not really get defeated until Gettysburg. It took until July of 1863 to finally beat Lee on the battlefield. The South had some great cavalry leaders. The Southern cavalry really outclassed the Union cavalry until late in the war. That was because old Jeff Davis had Nathan Bedford Forrest, maybe the best cavalry commander of all time. He also had Jeb Stuart. Stuart did well for much of the war, but let Lee down at Gettysburg. Lee's first defeat is really the responsibility of Jeb Stuart. Stuart failed to accomplish his primary mission of scouting, and he didn't let Lee know where the Union Army was located. This omission kept Lee in the dark for the critical opening days of the battle. You could say that Lee lost Gettysburg before the first shot was ever fired. Lee had normally been able to pick the ground that he fought on and always was able to control the movements of his troops. The collision at Gettysburg, the classic meeting engagement, took the advantage out of Lee's hands and handed him a defeat. Stuart did not survive the war. He died at the Battle of Yellow Tavern. Nathan Bedford Forrest did survive the war and continued to be a thorn in our side. He was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. Stonewall Jackson was another great Confederate general. He arrived by rail from the Shenandoah Valley at the critical point of the First Battle of Manassas or Bull Run. He moved his men to Henry House Hill, and when the Confederate troops under Bartow and Bee broke, General Bee pointed to Jackson and said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." They did exactly that. They rallied behind the Virginians and solidly trounced our boys. Jackson stepped into the history books at that moment and is forever known as Stonewall Jackson. Jackson was key to many of Lee's successes in battle. Jackson conducted the key movement that flanked General Hooker at Chancellorsville. Jackson got out in front of his men at the end of that battle. The Confederates mistook him for Union cavalry and he was shot. He caught pneumonia and died of his wounds a few days later. The Confederates had two General Johnstons, Sidney and Joe. Joe got wounded at Seven Pines and of course Lee got his army. Sidney Johnston went after U.S. Grant at Shiloh. Gave him a lick in the first day of the battle, but Grant got the better of him on day 2 and achieved a Union victory. Sidney Johnston was fatally wounded in that battle at Shiloh. Joe was eventually sent west. He served throughout the war, being part of the Vicksburg campaign, and later trying to stop Sherman from marching to the sea. Joe ended up surrendering to Sherman in North Carolina, a week or so after Lee threw in the towel at Appomattox. I do not have time to cover every general on the Confederate side, but we need to mention Longstreet, Pickett, Hood, and Bragg. General Longstreet was known as Old War Horse. He fought many campaigns, both with the Army of Northern Virginia independent actions, and with the Western Army out towards Tennessee. Longstreet is best known for arguing with Lee about the attacks on the second and third days of the Battle of Gettysburg. Turns out that Longstreet's idea of maneuver was better than the frontal attack of Pickett's charge. Pickett is of course famous for being a division commander in that charge. 7 brigade commanders died in that attack. Pickett survived, but he never forgave Lee. He called Lee that old man, and he accused him of killing his division. After the assault, Lee met the men returning from Pickett's charge, and shaking his head he said, "It is all my fault." He then turned to General Pickett and said, "General Pickett, reform your division." Pickett said, "I have no division." Both Pickett and Longstreet survived the war. General Hood was a great frontline combat commander. He lost his left arm at Gettysburg and his right leg at the Battle of Chickamauga. He ended up commanding the Army of Tennessee and may be remembered not for his great actions in previous battles, but for abandoning Atlanta. He also launched a frontal attack at Franklin that was larger than Pickett's charge, but with the same catastrophic results. Hood could not save Atlanta, Nashville, or stop Sherman. He did, however, survive the war. General Bragg won one of the major Confederate victories in the West at Chickamauga, but he failed to follow up on his success. Instead, he laid siege to the Union Army in Chattanooga and merely waited for Grant to break through his lines. Bragg was routed at Chattanooga and was shortly removed from command. Bragg survived the war. A young Southern boy came home from Sunday school and asked his mom, "Which part of the Bible, Old or New Testament, is Robert E. Lee in?" That tale demonstrates the love that the South had for General Lee. He once tried to lead an attack, I think it was at the Wilderness, and the sergeant grabbed his horse and shouted, "General Lee to the rear." The troops took up the refrain. General Lee was not going to be allowed to risk his life in a frontal charge. The South made a couple of big mistakes in the war. The 2 northern invasions. The South threw away their defensive advantage in hopes of scoring a Saratoga-like victory that might bring the English into the war. They got turned back at Antietam, which gave me the opportunity to launch the Emancipation Proclamation, and the second invasion at Gettysburg finally defeated Lee and put us on the road to victory. Couple Gettysburg with Vicksburg, and it was clear the South was eventually doomed. The South had a tough time in the Navy arena. They had no Navy to speak of and had to build it from scratch. The British helped with the production of some of the famous commerce raiders like the CSS Florida and Shenandoah. The CSS Virginia, or Merrimack, was our greatest scare. That ironclad warship destroyed 3 of the biggest ships in our fleet. But she finally got stopped from doing further damage by the arrival of the Monitor. The ironclad Monitor, with the turret, turned out to be the better design. The Confederates tried blockade runners, commerce raiders, ironclads, and even submarines to break the blockade. None of these efforts worked out in the end, though that submarine Hunley was credited with conducting the first successful submarine attack in history. The course includes a number of film links. All the links are valuable, but if you are short on time, concentrate on those marked with a red asterisk. Look below my icon and you will see a link to the Civil War resources and film clips. Let's adjourn and meet at my memorial to talk about the Union generals. There's a concert going on in the background there, and it should be interesting. And one more thing. Remember this. In the end, it's not the years in your life that count. It's the life in your years. Have a nice day.